Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Jordyne Blaise, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement for Circuit Clinical.
All right, I have 902. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We're thrilled you're here with us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. A special thank you to our partners at Vertex for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. Today, we have an amazing guest in Jordyne Blaise, who is at Circuit Clinical, and I think it's very fitting that as we ended Rare Disease Month yesterday, we're going to spend some time talking today about clinical trials and diversity and the importance of making sure that all patients are considered in our drug development process. So with that, I almost always forget this. The practical things for a webinar, please. We know you're going to have questions as we go through our conversation today. So please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and Derek and I will get to them as we have our conversation with Jordyne. So with that, I will hand it over to Derek to kick us off. Thanks.
Good morning, Jordyne. It is so great to have you here. We are psyched. We're going to talk diversity, equity, inclusion. We are going to talk community engagement. We can cover all ends of the spectrum. But before we do that, why don't we start with a little bit of an origin story, and you tell our guests how you came to be in biotech in the first place.
Oh, that's a great question. I wish it was a super interesting story, but my sister was there first, and she had shared with me that she joined a biotech company and it was introducing me to it was really my first foray into learning about clinical research and biotechnology as an industry, because I had spent years in government and tech. And she told me about this wonderful company that was doing work in sickle cell anemia, speaking of Rare Disease Day. And sickle cell is near and dear to my heart. I have close family members and friends who are living with sickle cell. And I thought to myself, wow, it never occurred to me that there was someone working on finding curative therapies for all of these conditions that so many of my loved ones are impacted by. So I found myself with the opportunity to head up diversity, equity, and inclusion in this biotechnology space. And ultimately, it carried me to Circuit Clinical because through that work and really, quite frankly, having family and friends who were really scared of clinical research or unsure about it at the very least. And if anything that this pandemic has taught us is there's so much criticality to reaching diverse communities relative to clinical research. I found myself at Circuit Clinical really, really wanting to expand access to research for every community everywhere.
So go ahead, Jennifer.
Go ahead. No, I want to go back a little bit further because I know our audience and they really, really like to know your origin. So talk to us a little bit about how you even started being interested professionally in working on DE&I issues and how you sort of chose that as part of your career path.
Yeah, that's a great question. So prior to working in biotech, I actually am a lawyer by training. So I graduated from Georgetown University Law School, and my background was in civil rights enforcement. So I worked for organizations like the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, really ensuring that civil rights programs and initiatives really were non-discriminatory in dissecting and reviewing legal cases as well as individual cases or incidences of discrimination, whether that be relative to employment discrimination or transportation access, education access, et cetera. And I actually was on that path because as a kid, I was actually bused. Very, very early on in my life, I knew that I was very interested in exploring and tackling school segregation and access, whether that be educational access or access to clinical therapies. I think that question of access has always been sort of a common thread through and theme throughout my life. And then that led to my work in diversity because I worked in higher education. So I did a little bit of both the civil rights enforcement, but also education around how do we look at this strategically and proactively versus in the reactive sense, right? Once things go wrong. I always tell people, once there's a legal case about it, we've gone a little further than we might have wanted to on the intervention side, but hopefully that work has been very much on the proactive end.
Yeah, I used to tell people when they saw me coming as a litigator that that was not good news.
There you go. Exactly. I was like, I wanted to be on the good news arrivals, as opposed to like,
No
oh,
one
Jordyne
liked
is
to
here.
see. They're like, oh.
All right. So when you even to kind of bring things back to biotech a little bit, when you said you stepped in as the director of DE&I, I mean, that is not a classically held position in the industry. And honestly, it's a position that I don't know when it first existed, but it was pretty recent. So, I mean, what were those conversations like? So the company was Bluebird Bio, right? And they're forward thinking gene therapy company, really, really innovative. So what were the conversations like? Were they actually looking for that role, or were you interested enough that they said this is important enough for us to pursue, and they kind of created that role for you? How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they were interested in the role. So they had the role listed, but ironically at the time, they weren't sure that DE&I could be a full-time role. So I actually, when I first started, I was doing diversity and development work. So they said, well, can you do a little bit on the career development path? And I'm like, well, I'm capable, but I certainly don't think I'll have time, but like, let's try this out.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long that I was there that I really started, and that's not common for most of my career, is that I'm the inaugural person in the role, meaning they've never had a DEI leader before.
Right.
And so while there absolutely was a warm welcome of like, we're happy you're here, we kind of know we're not quite there, but we're not really sure kind of why we're not there. Like, we're hoping that you can show us. They had worked with a consultant before. So it really was a warm welcome of very much, we're interested in diversity, but we really don't know how to take it from, we have these great monthly programs either put on by an employee or business resource group or a group of interested employees, and make that into a full-fledged strategy. So me stepping in was really introducing them to the potential that diversity, equity, and inclusion could be a strategy or a strategic advantage. And that honestly also was very much a part of the work relative to our patients at the time. So, when I came in, I think the expectation was like, we know that you'll be involved in recruiting. We know that you'll be involved in our like HR and people and culture. It was very early when I said, hey, like, yes, I can be involved in all of those things, but we really, really should be thinking about a clinical trial diversity task force. And I, along with a strong contingent of other folks at Bluebird, said, yeah, that's exactly what we should be thinking about. Because with sickle cell, it was obvious, like there, 97% or roughly or more of those patients are Black or African American or Latino. That wasn't the case for multiple myeloma, as an example, where in the oncology space, there is overrepresentation by race, but it wasn't necessarily that they were thinking of it that way. So we used that as a springboard to start to think about other ways to advance diversity that wasn't just about who can we recruit to the company. Right.
So what were your initial thoughts in like month 2 of that job, right? So I imagine you go in and you're excited about filling the role, but since it had never existed before, there was a very good chance of being there in month 2 being like, this is, these people have no idea what they're doing, right? So what was that like? What was the reception like, and what were your kind of feelings about both the company and the industry relating to DE&I?
I think working in biotech is always intimidating, because as someone whose background is not science, I mean, past high school, I was a super scientist. I was super into science in high school, but after that, I kind of went in another direction. I think it can be really intimidating, right? Because you go in saying, okay, they're literally trying to cure cancer. I mean, it's a turn of phrase that we use when we say, like, it's not like we're curing cancer, and they're like, no, that's actually what we're doing.
Like, that's right? Exactly what we're trying to do, actually.
And so that can be really intimidating to step into, in terms of like, what can I really offer this group that is meaningful and tangible? What I learned, really early on was that I had this incredible opportunity to expand and look at a different lens, right? Look through a different lens by which they approach their work. And what I meant by that is, I tell people all the time, if you look at a shape and it looks like a triangle, if you tilt it just slightly, you can see that it's a pyramid, right? But on face value, some of those things aren't aren't visible to you. And my sort of framework for that is I looked at the science as this triangle and I thought, wow, this is incredible. And I said, if I just tilted this just a little bit, do you see this different vantage point? And for me, that was, okay, well, we're working on these diseases. I'm curious about what does representation look like across different groups? So for multiple myeloma, African Americans have twice the incidence rates in multiple myeloma as their white counterparts. When they're diagnosed, it's often a more severe form, right? And so once I saw that, I was I remember that day because I was presenting to our oncology group and I was scared to put that in our presentation. And because I thought that might just be too rudimentary. Like I'm too embarrassed that they're going to say, well, duh,
Right.
that's page one, right?
Like we knew that.
Yeah, but I went with my gut and I was like, you know what, I'm going to try it. And while there were many people who said, yes, of course, yes, thank you for the reminder, there were a number of people in the room who had heard that for the first time. And what that made me recognize, and I think, while I will always say the reception was always warm, I really didn't have too many experiences where I was like kind of trying to fight to get like the relevance of my role across. But I did find new opportunities to engage my role in ways that they probably didn't imagine at the onset. So I do think they said, well, we know you'll be working with talent acquisition through,
Sure. Yeah.
You'll be in depth with our TA group. And I said, okay, well, let's look at our board. And they were like, I didn't think about that. So I got opportunities to think about diversifying our board and our senior leadership. And I do think that it was those things, right? That for me, there is a way that we welcome diversity, but it may be through a very limited lens or a limited scope. Like, well, we just thought you kind of help us with some Black History Month programming, some Women's History Month programming, since it's March 1st, happy Women's History Month, right? And maybe we didn't realize or recognize at the time that pretty much diversity can connect to every aspect of our work. So, when I talked to procurement about supplier diversity, they said, wow, I had a really strong advocate and ally in our procurement department who said, I'm passionate about supplier diversity. And we were able to, launch some initiatives, particularly for our size company at the time, around supplier diversity. So you had all of this incredible opportunity of folks who said, I wouldn't have thought diversity was all of these things, but now that I'm learning that it's more than, the surface.
Yeah. So that brings us to Circuit a little bit, and let's actually get into a little bit of what you do, because I think it's probably leveled up here. But before we do that, why don't you talk to everyone and tell us a little bit about what Circuit Clinical does?
Yeah. So Circuit Clinical is an integrated research organization that expands access to clinical research in two ways. One is through a national site network where we take new to research health systems and we spin up and create clinical research sites in those new to research health systems under the basic premise that we want to create access to clinical research where people are knowing and seeing doctors they know and trust. A number of those research centers and sites are with federally qualified health centers or community health centers, which serve very diverse, racially diverse, economically diverse patient populations. The other side is Trial Journey, which is a product that allows for participants in clinical research to share their ratings and reviews of their clinical research sites. And it also is an easy way to find and locate clinical trials near you. So I think of it like Yelp for clinical trial sites. Is the simple one sentence version of that. And my role there is the Vice President of Equity and Community Engagement, where essentially I'm responsible for really building out our strategic landscape as it relates to expanding access to underrepresented populations as it relates to research.
Right. So for absolute diehard fans of this program, Irfan Khan is the CEO of Circuit Clinical, and I think he was guest number 2 or number 3 on the on the virtual breakfast series. So blast from the past. Circuit Clinical is a wonderful company. They've won the 47 North competition multiple times out of Buffalo, and we're really excited to see how they've grown. So when we talked beforehand, I took a stab at a definition of community engagement, or I asked you what it was, and you rattled off what sounded like the absolute perfect descriptor of what engagement is, because it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So what does it mean to you to engage with the community?
Yeah, for me, it is a meaningful, bi-directional relationship between a community and an organization. And I am quick to emphasize that bi-directional means it goes in two directions, right? That means the community has the opportunity to contribute, to share, to offer feedback, as much as we have the ability to share and bring opportunities to the community. So I can't emphasize that enough, that bi-directional, and that it has to be meaningful.
Yeah, we found, it was interesting last year in 2021, we started with a new program at New York Bio with our patient engagement summit. And we found that not only has it been that kicked off then adding sustained patient voices to our annual meeting, right, through their stories and their experiences. And we found it was so enriching for both sides to have access to the information, both for patient advocates to have information that we were providing from, companies and strategies about, public policy, but then to hear the stories and frankly, the trials, clinical or otherwise, right, that patients have to go through, especially when they have rare disease. It was really impactful to those researchers, like you were saying, even within your own company that didn't understand the impact on certain populations of a disease state. It brought things sort of full circle for us, and we realized the value to our entire community for that.
Absolutely. I can't overstate the value of really hearing from those voices. And what I'd add to from community, at least community engagement from my lens, also includes doctors. Primary physicians. So one of the things I think is special about Circuit and the opportunity that we have is we are working with new to research partners, which means that this literally has the potential to change the face of clinical research in our country. And I am right. I love things that are ripe for potential, right? And one of the conversations I've had with a lot of these doctors is I'm seeing folks in the community. So I have this really impeccable sense of how this medicine or this therapy works in real life, right? In real time, right? So this is outside of the, kind of bounds of a lab, but into a community, down to time of day, what comorbidities or other conditions a patient like they see is most likely to have that might impact their experience. And, while our health systems may be new to research, I certainly don't think that means that they are in any way naive, right, to the experiences of their patients or even to the scientific knowledge of the actual drug or treatment. So when I think about this opportunity for community engagement, there are so many things that we learn by listening, right? That we can pick up, and having the opportunity to exchange that information is such a critical part of this like holistic sense of how we get the best therapies to the most people as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So to frame this a little bit, so the way that we do clinical trials now, it's a large fraction that is done by large academic medical centers, right? It's close to about 90% is run out. 90% of the trials are done by 10% of the institutions. Is that about right? So there are this massive group of doctors, caregivers, et cetera, that, like you said, have generally been seeing patients yet are kind of unexposed to clinical trials. So in your role, what does the initial conversation look like, right? Because I'm sure that many of these centers have been, given the flyer with the benefits of doing clinical research on them, right? Or they've been someone has tried to sell them on a clinical trial before, right? So what does the first conversation usually go like?
You know what's funny about that? Oftentimes the first conversation is no one's ever asked us.
Really?
Honestly, you'd be shocked, but I would say more often than not, the first conversation is like, I would love to do research. No one ever asked us. Or, someone offered the opportunity to do research, but it was a one and done, right?
Yeah.
So it was a relationship that they came in and said, well, we want access to your patients. So that we can conduct a singular study, but they didn't necessarily see that doctor as a PI or a sub PI or as a thoughtful kind of partner in this longitudinal, sort of research sense, right? So they got like that one, very narrow snapshot, but maybe not the holistic picture of the timeline and the pipeline of drug development. So the first conversation oftentimes is, wow, like no one's ever asked us. And then the second is kind of like, well, what does that look like? What are the barriers? Like, I think it's likely expensive. What does it look like? Because these are often physicians who they're not, time is not a resource that is overflowing for them.
Right.
And so oftentimes it's not necessarily a lack of interest or a hesitancy about research. It really is like, is there a way to do this and make it feel seamless and smooth, make it as seamless and smooth as possible. The other reaction we get from time to time is really around trust. Is like, well, I don't want to, give you access to this patient population so they can be like just test subjects, right? I hate that. Yeah, that word subjects always like gives me a little twinge, right? And so we go, my approach going in that first conversation is to really establish two things. One is you get to be the expert here. You get to be the PI or the sub PI, and we really value you as a trusted partner in this. Not we're not going here and saying, hey, can you give us a list of your patients so we can email them a trial? We are really creating a relationship. The other piece is we want to make sure that we're honoring that trust relationship. So it takes a lot for a doctor to be able to build up trust in communities and with their patients. And we hold that as sacred. And so how do we honor that trust? By expanding access. So I'm big on this, and we talked about this earlier, where, for me, it's not about bring patients as many trials as possible. For me, it's about give patients the opportunity to make a decision about their participation in research. And I'm okay if that decision is no. I mean, I think that might be a radical thing to say, but the reality is I would rather have them, have an informed no than a yes, that they didn't really get a chance to think about or make an active decision. And you'll hear me say this time and time again, where for me, it's about expanding access, not accessing. Like, it's I don't want to access patients. I want to offer them access so they can make the decision about whether this is right for them.
Yeah.
And
so go ahead, Jennifer.
I was gonna say, and how do you decide when you're thinking like within the circuit clinical lens, and how do you decide where to go next, right? Like, how do you decide who is on your list that you need to talk to, because it will benefit their patients if they think about participating in clinical trials?
Yeah, so we have this really amazing partnership with LabCorp Diagnostics, and a lot of our kind of direction sometimes, and we have kind of two chunks. One direction is really a true partnership with LabCorp, where they are working with us to identify particularly federally qualified health centers and community health systems or centers that would be an ideal spot for our expansion. The other kind of deciding factor is a combination of things such as location. So where are places that are not overly saturated, where people have to, sometimes travel 2 or more hours to access a research center. So sometimes it can be something as simple as location and access. Oftentimes, and then we have some requirements, like we really want it to be a health system with a good contingent of doctors who are willing to serve as PI. So, our model doesn't really work if we go into a place that doesn't really have a doctor that's at least interested in research.
Yeah.
We will offer them training. We will bring the trials to them. But if they're not really interested in conducting research, then the model doesn't really work, right? And so we have the great, we're nimble, we're quick, and we have the opportunity to learn fast, right? Or fail fast, honestly, and really determine that nice intersection of factors that make a site a great potential site.
So I'm interested in the no's, right? So I'm interested in what do you learn? What have you learned from the people that say no, and why do people say no a lot of times? So it's funny because very, very often I imagine that when, if anyone had asked me and said no before, that's probably the end of the conversation, right? For a long time, the onus has been, we need to speed up the enrollment of the trial. So we are keeping score. If we need 100 patients, by the time we get to 100, we're done, right? And, if you say no, that's great, I will go find someone else. So what are the things that you kind of learn from a no in your conversations?
Yeah, honestly, I love a good no. And what I mean by that is I always tell people I get the luxury of not being in patient recruitment. I'm in community engagement, which means that I don't necessarily need a bunch of yeses. Like I just need folks to be aware and informed and engaged with this idea of clinical research. But I will tell you that stepping into this space, particularly when it comes to underrepresented populations, so these are racial and ethnic minorities, folks who are underserved communities, socioeconomic status, low income, et cetera, right? Is that there's an assumption that the root of every no is a lack of trust, either in the healthcare system or in, big pharma, drug development, or whatever that looks like. But what the no's have really afforded us the opportunity to explore is that trust can be a reason, but it is not the reason, right? And I'm always careful to say, I've talked to community doctors who say, trust, I have the opposite problem of trust. They trust me so much that if I even hint that this is the right thing to do, they will do it, which means that it's a lot on me to make sure that my suggestion to them is very well researched, right? Because the suggestion from me might as well be a decree, right? Because they're like, yes, doctor, whatever you said, doctor, I will do that. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I noted was that in these no's, sometimes it is a factor of location. Like I just can't make that many visits, or transportation, or convenience, right? Or protocol, right? This trial requires a laparoscopy, and I'm not really willing to get a laparoscopy, but otherwise I would be interested, right? And so I've really learned that no doesn't necessarily mean that they are against clinical research as a whole.
Right.
It just may mean that that specific trial doesn't work for them. And what community engagement offers me, and even the advantage of Trial Journey, says, hey, I know you said no to this trial, but if you have a chronic condition, if you have an experience with a product that may not be working for you and you're curious about alternatives, right? Here's an opportunity to search and find trials that may be close to you that you may be interested in, right? And so that no is really, the assumption is the no means I don't trust and I don't trust clinical research as a whole. Even what, I learned in a long time of talking about COVID research, right? COVID was new. It is unknown. It is scary for a lot of folks. And so for all those folks who said no, or they weren't interested in participating in research around a vaccine development for COVID specifically, if I were to approach them and said, hey, I know you have a chronic condition, seborrheic dermatitis, or you have osteoarthritis, or any of these chronic conditions, are you interested in alternatives or clinical research studies? Overwhelmingly, those folks said yes, absolutely. It may just, that specific trial wasn't right for me, or my lack of trust was really related to that specific circumstance, as opposed to this holistic, absolute no view.
Yeah. And I do think it's interesting, you bring up COVID. I think, and we've talked about this on the webinar repeatedly, I think COVID has also served to heighten the awareness of things like drug development, clinical trials. I mean, he was at 14 at the time, right? He's 16 now, was like all over me to sign him up for a vaccine trial, and I did, but he wasn't selected, but it was still like, he brought that to me because he had read about it in the news and heard about it. And so I do think hopefully that has also had the opportunity to say to people, like, these things exist if they didn't know it.
Absolutely. Well, that's what's fascinating, right? Is that COVID and that conversation has opened up so many opportunities to have those conversations. And even for folks who may have felt uncomfortable or resistant to COVID vaccine trials, we're having conversations about drug development that they had never had before. I know from a community engagement standpoint, I was seeing webinars and talks just talking about how the vaccine was developed was huge in terms of vaccine hesitancy in a lot of communities, right? And what was really tremendous about this opportunity for me was I got the opportunity to have conversations about advancements in HIV drug development and how the COVID, vaccine development, was able to advance even HIV drug development. And a lot of that, a lot of that development was from years and years of research and learnings that we had in other areas, right? And being able to talk about the science of this and the real rich potential that this has brought, has absolutely opened up opportunities and conversations we otherwise probably wouldn't be having, at least not, this much in the vernacular, right?
Right, exactly, yes. Not where our teenagers are understanding.
Exactly.
Well, it also opened the door much more to decentralized trials too, right? So it kind of gave this opportunity for really the whole industry to think about breaking out of that, 90% academic medical center model.
Absolutely. Because we were forced to, right? I think,
Yeah.
It also, honestly, in addition to the decentralized trials, it also really upended kind of a lot of ways patient, diversity in clinical research. Like, I think that I'm not, by no means am I saying that this is a new phenomenon in the wake of COVID, but even the nuance by which we think about clinical research diversity, because 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it might have been like, okay, Black. But we even saw in the onset of the pandemic that people who were frontline workers were at higher risk, and what their experiences were like that was different from someone like me, who I may be Black, I may be an ideal patient purely based on race, but I have the fortune of working from home. So I wasn't facing the same exposure as someone in public transit or other like front-facing frontline worker careers. And so what I do think that this also afforded us was the opportunity to look at that patient diversity with a little more nuance than we might have even 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yep. No, I would absolutely agree. I think one of the things that has hopefully come out of this and hopefully stays is that we tended to have a little bit more appreciation for, to use your word, the greater amount of nuance within people's individual experiences.
Yes.
Right? We realize that things don't affect everyone equally, and if you were a frontline hospital worker, if you were if you were in a position where you had to see people all day and lots of different people, you actually got a much different sense of that rather than someone that went and worked in an office and worked with the same 8 people the entire time.
Absolutely.
Did you find that, we'll stick with the COVID theme for a second. Did you find that it was harder or easier to talk with physicians or physician practices or health centers about clinical trials sort of as they were dealing with COVID, right? Because clearly they were overwhelmed with in some senses, in some pockets, in some times. And that was the thing, because it spread in waves across the US, right? How did you find practitioners to be receptive throughout COVID?
I think it was both, to be honest. I think that, of course, it was made harder because the health systems were slammed. Like it's sort of like we don't really have time to do anything because we're just trying to make it through the day at this point. So I think that was an obvious barrier. But what I do think was interesting was, one, what made it easier was the same thing that it made it easier for you to talk to your son, right? Is that like drug development and clinical research was the top of everyone's list, and everyone was having conversations about it that they may not have had before. The other thing I think that was happening was, because they were being slammed and they were seeing in real time the experiences of their patients, they absolutely understood why bringing research where they were, because you got to realize too, with COVID, some of these studies, you needed to enroll someone within like an hour or 2 hours or 30 minutes of a positive test. So it's not, I have a chronic condition, you can email me and I can come back in 2 weeks.
Right.
We were thinking like sometimes it was a matter of hours that we needed to enroll folks. So there wasn't the sort of scenario where someone can come in the office, get a test, and you can say, oh, well, can you drive 2 hours
next week
while you feel sick, drive 2 hours to this research center or 30 minutes to this research center to participate in this study. I think that's where the decentralized trials came into play. And I think that's where a lot of physicians' practices started to really understand why it was so important to have access or the opportunity to access research where they were. Sending someone downstairs is a lot different than sending them, even 30 minutes away. I keep saying 2 hours, but oftentimes it's really a 20-minute drive. Like, I had COVID in January and I could not drive 20 minutes anywhere, right? And so thinking about that made those conversations easier. And I do think that seeing what was made possible, by research in such a incredible way in real time also made, a lot of these health systems say, wow, I do want my patients to be able to access that. And, we talk about, research as a care option, not being the last resort, but being like, one of many choices earlier on. So I do think that absolutely opened up conversation for those practices.
Yeah.
So I think we can switch gears a little bit here, but I want to keep things on the DE&I front. And instead of talking about kind of patients and clinical trials, we can address kind of the elephant in the room. Let's talk about, management. Let's talk about the board. Let's talk about the other area where, honestly, our industry could improve. So, you came into Bluebird and now you're a clinical. Now you have both kind of the inward and the outward lens on things. So how did you, so again, winding the clock back, how did you kind of think about things when you first came to Bluebird? Because now you are, they said, oh, you can work with talent acquisition, right? So what were your initial thoughts on kind of talent acquisition in biotech and, some of the ways that we thought about that and some of the ways that you thought it could be better?
Yeah, one of the things I found the most surprising when I first started was that biotech at the time, biotech is in a way is like a new emerging industry within a very old industry. And, you got pharma and biotech. I know a lot of companies that are like, we're not pharma, we're biotech. Like we got this different, kind of tilt. But what I also noticed was like, and that's amazing. And you'll see kind of the sort of, I think it's fluid, right? A lot of pharma companies have biotech divisions or have acquired biotech. So I don't think it's as stringent as like they're over there and we're over here. I look at,
I would think so, but
I look collectively at drug development, but I also found that for so many, it was like, well, have you worked in biotech before? Even in roles that didn't necessarily require it, or when they said, hey, we're out to do something that's never been done before. And so I said, well, how do you get experience in doing something that's never been done before? It's literally the definition of never been done before means no one's done it, right? And so, we started to really challenge those assumptions of, what is and that does not mean that industry experience is to be not valued. But it does mean that I pushed organizations to articulate what specific value does industry experience bring, right? What problem solving skills, what knowledge, certifications, information does one get or glean from being in the industry other than just a blanket, you've been in the industry for X amount of years. And why I push for that is, I hear a lot about, and I'm going to I don't want to conflate two ideas, but I will say that I hear a lot about like a lack of diversity. And there absolutely is a challenge to diversity in every industry across the board. So it's not, I hear this in STEM fields. I'm like, tech says the same thing. Biotech says the same thing. Pharma says the same thing. And if you go to higher education or government, they are saying the same things too.
Yeah.
And what I tell people is the talent exists, right? Like the talent can be staring you in the face, but if you have made a determination that is a very narrow picture of what that talent looks like, or if I have honest conversations with organizations that say, Jordyne, we really want diversity. And we thought about, posting our jobs in different places. I hear that a lot, right? We want to post it in a different thing. And I said, well, do most of your hires come from personal referrals and word of mouth? And they go, yeah. And I'd say, well, what difference does it make where you post it, right? And those are the hard, nuanced conversations that we need to be willing to have if we want to talk about diversifying the industry, right? If I talk to someone and say, tell me, 5 people of color that you've worked with in your career, 20 years in pharma, 25 years in biotech, et cetera. If you can't name me 5, right, then that I can go back to your companies and I'll probably find and count 5 just by tracking on LinkedIn who worked at this company from this year to this year, right? So some of that is, who are you willing to get to know, mentor, sponsor, connect with, and to diversify your sort of thing. So your sort of network. And the third piece for me is, if we're talking about reaching a patient population that's not reflected in our leadership, we're asking patients to trust us. I say this all the time. You want them to trust you, but you're not willing to trust them. And what I mean by that is, you don't trust people who look like them, who are them, who share their lived experiences, but you're saying, hey, trust me. And I really, really push back on that and say, like, if we want to think about thinking of ideas differently, it's not just diversity for the sake of it. Like, if I show up at the room and I'm a woman, that doesn't just mean, hey, the room is now diverse, therefore this other thing happens, right? But what it does mean is there's different ideas in the room. There are different lived experiences, and I can tell you, I can come in a room and share an experience that is very unique to me. And the same person, another Black woman, could come in the room and have a totally different and unique lived experience and add to the conversation in a different and unique way. And so for me, that diversity really has to go across from senior leadership, from your board, to entry-level employees and everywhere in between. But we have to be willing to do things a little more differently than we've done them before.
Yeah. I think the piece about recognizing, I'll start there, recognizing that your network may not be as diverse as it needs to be, is really helpful. And I have seen, and maybe, I think it was Craig Lipset maybe that posted recently on LinkedIn, right? Like, here's a position. I know my network isn't as, basically, like, I want to expand the opportunities, and your networks may be, broader. And so, like, take a look at this opportunity. And it struck me because we're actually filling a role right now for NewYorkBIO. And I was like, you're right, because that, just asking other people to access their networks on your behalf can then serve to expand your network as well, right? Because you'll make those connections. And I think that that's really important.
Absolutely. And I think what's equally important is if you know your network looks a certain way, you have the power to change it.
Yeah.
Like tomorrow, right? You can have a coffee talk with someone, and you can commit to saying, and that doesn't mean, you call and say, hi, I don't know any women in my network. Can I have a coffee talk with you? But it does mean, like, there are tons of women in biotech, women of color in pharma. There are tons of organizations that you can lend your time, talent, and treasure to, and say, like, I'm doing this because I know that this will shift and expand my network in ways that it currently isn't. I love, NewYorkBIO is a great example, right, of organizations that you can be a part of and meet different people and use that as an opportunity to engage them, so that your network looks different than it won't change sort of by osmosis. Like, you have to kind of actively work to change it. So absolutely kind of making that push and taking that extra step of saying, hey, I have this opportunity, and saying, hey, I have this opportunity. If you know someone underrepresented in your network who might be interested, I'm available for coffee to tell them about it. Like, not just, hey, here's a link to apply, but let me really give you some background on why I think this could be cool for you.
When we get into the challenges of either kind of senior leadership, C-level positions, or board roles, one of the challenges is, these are not, it's not like you're not recruiting 50 of them, right? You're recruiting one. It's a one-off recruitment. And that's one of the things that structurally makes things difficult to change. That's not an excuse for it not changing, but people can very often run a process either with someone in mind already. I would like to add Doug to our board, and Doug is not diverse, but we also want diversity on our board. So what are some of the ways that you think about what I'll call the challenge of small numbers, right? Adding one person or adding a small number of people to an already small group of people that, and we've seen the benefits of this, right? There are studies that show diverse boards, companies with diverse boards perform better. How do you handle that conversation? Because, like you said, we very often fall back on the word of mouth problem. And if you can't name 5 people over here, your word of mouth pool is not going to get you to the diverse candidates that you want.
Yeah. So one thing is, the small numbers is a double-edged sword, right? Which means small numbers, not a lot of positions, but it also means 1 or 2 can change the entire landscape of a board, right? So it doesn't really take a lot. That's number one. I think that the challenge, I think, for a lot of boards is like, oh my gosh, where am I ever going to find someone to be on our board because of the numbers and the lack of diversity and all these things? And I'm like, you're literally looking for one, like you're looking for one. And oftentimes the one you're looking for, and this is one thing that I engage in practice with in Bluebird, and I continue with other organizations, is, well, let's start with, what are you looking for in a board member, right? Because oftentimes in that example, they say, I want Doug, but they're not willing to really ask themselves, like, okay, well, why do you want Doug? And when I ask that, they say, well, Doug, I've known him for years. I'm like, besides that, what else? Okay, well, Doug has experience as a CFO in a publicly traded company. I'm like, boom, that's what we call a qualification. Doug is not the only CFO of a publicly traded company. There are literally thousands of those. Okay, what else? well, Doug has been a part of a community service org or something else, right? And then I say, okay, well, let's drill down. What does your board not have? Right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we don't, our board doesn't have a very diverse network. And then we start to play a little bit with this dance of building an ideal board member rather than Doug being just an ideal person, right? I believe each one of us is unique and amazing, but I also believe that just like we can find Doug, we can find someone else who embodies those characteristics, but also might bring a different lived experience to our leadership. And what it really boiled down to is when the leadership accepted that there were options out there, right? There was talent out there. They existed. They were real. They were tangible. You just don't know them. Mm-hmm. They changed their perspective. And then we did the work. Like we worked and sourced really incredible talent. I think of a particular candidate who I really, really wanted to be a part of this board, had been on boards before. They had never heard of this person. And the reason that we didn't end up having this person on the board was because they actually were appointed to a White House position. And so what I like to highlight to people is that we talk a lot about the lack of talent, and this person was a person of color and a woman of color, I should say. And we talk about this lack of talent, or there's not enough people and there's not enough. And I'm like, however, when you find that person, you just better believe that they are going to be incredible, right? And I'm often, I want to point this out too, because this is something that I think is important. Oftentimes when we look at women of color or other people of color to take on leadership opportunities, it's really not enough that they just be really strong leaders in their organization, like a really strong vice president, right? Even though we have plenty of boards of white men who were really strong VPs and knew someone and they were on their board, right? Oftentimes when we find a Black or a brown or Latinx or woman of color or woman candidate, they are above and beyond. And so I'm always quick to push back on this idea that in order for candidates who are underrepresented to compete or to be worthy of that opportunity, they have to be like the 10X or the 11X version. But really to take a look at our current boards and say, what does our talent pool look like? And how much were we willing to give people a chance when they were white men or white folks in general, that we may not notice, or we don't see it as giving them a chance, that we might apply that to a person of color, if that makes sense, where we say, okay, I'm just giving them a chance, right? Which is in reality, we just give people chances, all people.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, thinking about this, I think I actually know the person that you're talking about that went to the White House position. So we can talk about that one afterwards. It's interesting. You think about all of this, and I think back to, you think about recruiting for clinical trials, and I think in a lot of ways we optimize for speed rather than thoughtfulness, right? We say the faster you can get somebody in, the faster you can announce it, the faster they can actually integrate into things. So it's probably progressed to the point where, if you know someone and if you can get the rest of the group excited about that person, the process can play out and be done. But what happens is you shorten things with the word of mouth process. You don't start with this big pool of people. You start with 2 people you're already tremendously excited about. And, then the process runs out and you actually didn't really run this entire process. You just started with the end goal in mind.
Yep. And we pushed for process. It's like, before you even show us the person that's in your heart of hearts, or you show anyone else, let us show you our pool first. And we found a pool, we sourced a pool because we had actual requirements, like we had needs, right? We identified those needs and we matched a group and contingent of folks to the needs of the organization. And time again, when I bring that crop of candidates and we put them against whoever you had in the back of your mind, it's more likely that crop of candidates outperforms the person you had in your mind when you're able to look at the needs objectively. Because when you have a person in mind, it's kind of hard to see anything else. So I tell people, let's just not see them to begin with. Let's see, who's out there first as a first measure, as opposed to a last measure, which is we've run through this and they conflicted out. So now I'll be willing to entertain whoever else you got, is to attach some semblance of a process to it.
Yeah. And what do you, one other thing that we haven't talked about, and I know we have less than 10 minutes, is scientific training is often necessary for a lot of the roles that we have in our companies and in biotech and pharma companies. How do we start the process? Because it's not like you just show up and you have a PhD in molecular chemistry, right? How do we start the process of engaging more diverse communities early on, middle school, high school, in science as a career option?
Yeah, I would honestly say before we do that, we need to expand we just need to expand what we view as experience. So what I find is, in addition to needing that PhD, you probably need to work at one of like 4 labs. And I know they're in Cambridge, San Francisco, and they're in New York, right? And I am quick to point that out because actually a colleague of mine who's brilliant and runs a biotech company in Dallas has said, part of the reason my science is so good is I snatched up all of the talent in the South and the Midwest that the coasts were not willing to even look at.
Yeah.
And yes, I do want us to emphasize pipeline programs, but the reality is if I put a middle schooler in a pipeline program and they go to a HBCU and get that PhD, but you're not even willing to look at HBCU talent,
Right.
then the pipeline is for naught. And so
yeah,
I want to shift our perspective of what scientific training looks like, and expand that opportunity. The other piece, which I think, we're ultimately getting at, is we need to create opportunities for people to see clinical research as a career option, or drug development more broadly. So to your point, that PhD in chemistry doesn't just have to go to academia. But similarly, there are folks in MBA programs who might have a BA in chemistry who would be excellent on our sales and commercialization side. And so how do we look holistically at opportunities available in drug development and bring them to folks so that we can kind of match what your skills and interests are to what is available in terms of, the long-term outlook and needs of the organization.
Yeah, and here's a plug too for a shameless plug. New York Bio has a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force, which is meeting in person March 30th to talk about some of these issues and how we as a community can support existing initiatives, right? Because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, but also are there gaps that we can uniquely fill? So if you're interested in participating with us on March 30th, reach out to me. We'll be glad to plug you into the process for everyone who's listening.
Yeah.
We definitely.
There's no shame in that plug. These are,
that's a good plug.
This is a good plug. This is literally, this isn't, well, it isn't quite the engagement of the community. We need to have the other direction where the community comes back, but we're at least starting that conversation.
Absolutely.
And
okay, so we've got to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say we have a few minutes left, and I think Jennifer, you brought up what I think is a perfect topic to think about here, because there are a lot of organizations like ours that all want to make an impact in DE&I. I think I think many people have recognized that it's important, and a lot of task forces want to do something valuable. So in your experience, what are kind of the top 3 things that a new task force should think about, right? In terms of not reinventing the wheel, in terms of doing something impactful. So what is your top down 3 top things to think about if you're starting a DE&I task force?
Oh, that's a good one. The first thing is the makeup of the task force. I always think that the DEI task force should include people from, commercial, from the scientific background, from HR. Like, it just should look like a very diverse group of folks in many respects. The second I would say for me is absolutely around education. So oftentimes we jump into a task force and we're well-meaning, but we really haven't gotten any background training or education on, like, what do we mean by diversity? What does equity look like? What is medical racism? What are barriers to clinical trial access? There's a lot of learning to do that you can do as a part of a task force to just ground yourself. And the second is to identify goals. And I think a lot of task force spend like 6 months just getting to goals. But I always say, ask it in a different way, right? Which is, a year from now, you're, on a panel and someone says, your task force did great the past year. Tell me a little bit about what you accomplished. if you finish that sentence, start with the end in mind. What 3 things do you want to be able to say at that? And it really should be simple, right? Like, we clarified what data we were collecting, or we appointed 1 person to the board. Like, sometimes, sometimes task forces say, we want to change the face of research. I'm like, that would be nice, but that's a heavy lift. Right. Sometimes it's quick to start with the end in mind. And so I would say those 3 things for me are goals, education, and then a diverse makeup of the group.
Yeah, that's great. We've got several. So it's funny. We actually are getting good ideas from the audience too in the chat, and someone who's asked if you can be on a panel in the future.
Yes,
so this is very helpful.
Well, this one is great. This is actually from Mark Sedum, who is the new head of tech transfer at NYU, and who we've had some of these discussions with before. I like it when people get lively in the chat here. I think this is something that we've recognized for a long time. We had Elliot Francis, who was the director of DE&I for the bio organization on, I guess it was probably about a year ago. And one of the things that we talked about and didn't shy away from was bio's initial report on DE&I within the industry. That the bottom line of that report is that our industry has work to do, right? Yes. And I think if we have the more people that we have that recognize it as a problem and are working to do things to actually solve it and attack it in intelligent ways, I think we're going to make progress. I don't know if it's going to be quite as fast as we would like it to be, but I think incremental progress is still progress. And I think it'll start to move faster. I think it'll start to be exponential. I think it's going to build on itself. So we have a couple of minutes left. And I thought about this before, and the way that I wanted to end this is, do you have an example of maybe a small win that turned into a big win, right? In thinking about this, small steps are important. So you have any examples from a DE&I standpoint of, kind of a small step that actually had big repercussions down the road?
Oh, so many. The 2 that I can think of was a small win was around like finally getting consensus around like, yeah, we need to diversify our board. We have a position available. Jordyne, can you just show us a few candidates that would be good? Like, and I'm not a recruiter by any means, but I moonlight as one. I did that day and I'm like, oh, you want me to show you good? I'll show you amazing. And I can see the impact of that decision on the boards of companies that I've been a part of right now. Like, I can go and say, wow, look at the board. And I think that is a huge win that has longstanding repercussions. The second one I would say is actually a one that I that is not mine. I actually worked with a group at Bluebird that is our LGBTQ resource group, employee resource group. And I encouraged a lot of our employee resource groups to work with each other. Someone who worked in our apheresis department was responsible for labeling. So this is very specific, but they labeled the bags that patients would receive infusions with, essentially. And we were, as a company, able to choose our own labels. Some of the work that we did talked about gender stereotypes. And typically the bags were named John Doe, or like the label would have a John Doe kind of name on it. And we talked about the importance of diversity of naming. And that person, Beth Gardner, was one of my former colleagues, worked with a group to shift the standardization of labeling to use more gender expansive names, as well as more ethnic names as a part of that labeling. So super simple, but imagine the impact and who gets to feel seen, that the labeling is not just John Doe or Jane Doe, but that it looks more dynamic than that when we think about patient diversity. So yeah.
Well,
here's where I apologize to my fictional friend Doug for dragging him into this.
Poor Doug. Doug, please forgive me.
I'm so sorry, Doug.
At least he didn't choose Karen.
That's true.
So, thank you, Jordyne, for participating today. I think we all had lots of great takeaways, and we look forward to having conversations with you offline about how we can impact our communities as well. So, thank you.
And if it's okay, I saw a lot of comments. I just typed my email in the box. If folks did have questions or wanted to reach out, please do.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for participating. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Yep.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.